By now, some 20 or 30 minutes after the Union guns stopped firing, and consequently about half that long since Alexander followed suit, much of the smoke had been diffused or had drifted off, so that for the attackers, many of whom had stepped at a stride from the dense shade of their wooded assembly areas into the brilliant sunlight that dappled the floor of the valley, the result was not only dazzling to their eyes, but also added to their feeling of elation and release. Before us lay bright fields and fair landscape, one among them would recall. It was not until the effect of this began to wear off, coincidental with the contraction of their pupils, that they saw at last the enormity of what was being required of them. And by then, although the vista afforded absolute confirmation of their direst apprehensions, the pattern of exhilaration had been set. Under the double influence of secondary inertia and terrific deliberation, the long gray lines came on, 3 brigades to the south under Pickett and 6 to the north under Pettigrew and Trimble, with a quarter-mile gap between the interior flanks of the two formations, the former composed of 15 and the latter of 27 regiments, all with their colors flying at more or less regular intervals along the rows of nearly 11,000 striding men. Harvey Hill was to say of the individual Confederate, as he had observed him in offensive action, of shoulder-to-shoulder courage, spirit of drill and discipline, he knew nothing and cared less. Hence, on the battlefield, he was more of a freelance than a machine. Whoever saw a Confederate line advancing that was not crooked as a ram's horn, each ragged rebel yelling on his own hook and aligning on himself. But Hill, though he was to see about as much combat as any general on either side before the war was over, was not at Gettysburg. If he had been, he would have had to cite it as the exception. Forbidden to step up the cadence or fire their rifles or even give the high-pitched yell that served at once to steady their own nerves and jangle their opponents, the marchers concentrated instead on maintaining their alignment, as if this in itself might serve to awe the waiting bluecoats and frighten them into retreat. And in point of fact, according to one among the watchers on the ridge across the way, a colonel commanding a brigade adjacent to the little clump of trees, it did at least produce the lesser of these two reactions. For him, the advancing graybacks had the appearance of being fearfully irresistible, while a foreign observer whose point of vantage was on the near side of the valley used the same adjectives to communicate the impression the attackers made on him. They seemed impelled by some irresistible force. Out front with the rebel skirmishers, a captain had a closer view of the troops as they strode down the slope toward where he crouched. And he remembered ever afterwards the glittering forest of bayonets, the 2 half-mile wide formations bearing down in superb alignment, the murmur and jingle of trouser legs and equipment, and the rustle of thousands of feet amid the stubble, which stirred up dust and chaff beneath and before them like the dash of spray at the prow of a vessel. They came on at a steady rate of about 100 yards a minute, and before they had been 3 minutes in the open, barely clear the line of friendly guns whose cannoneers raised their hats in salute and wished them luck as they passed through, the Union batteries, as if in quick recovery from the shock of seeing them appear thus, massed for slaughter, began to roar. The gray lines dribbled ragdoll shapes, each of which left a gap where it had been while still in motion. Flags plunged with sudden flutters in the windless air, only to be taken up at once as the fallen color bearers were replaced. This happened especially often in the regiments on the flanks, which came under galling long-range fire delivered in enfilade from the two heights, Cemetery Hill on the left and Little Round Top on the right. Pettigrew's troops had farther to go, since they had begun their march from Seminary Ridge itself, but this had been foreseen and allowed for. Pickett had been charged with closing the quarter-mile interval between the two formations, which would lengthen the distance his 3 brigades would have to cover in the course of their advance. Accordingly, once they were clear of the line of guns in plain view of the little clump of trees just over half a mile ahead, he gave his troops the order, "Left oblique." They obeyed it neatly, executing in mid-stride a half-face to the north, which at every full step of their own brought them half a step closer to the flank of the undeviating marchers on their left. All this time, both groups were taking losses, a more or less steady leakage of killed and wounded who lay motionless where they fell or turned and hobbled painfully up the slope they had descended. Coming presently to a slight dip about midway of the valley, a swale not deep enough to hide them from the enemy gunners, but conveniently parallel to the ridge that was their objective, Pickett's men received their second order, which was to halt, close up the gaps their casualties had left, and dress the line. They did so, once more with the deliberate precision of the drill field, but with the difference that such gaps continued to appear at an even more alarming rate as the Union gunners, delighted with this sudden transformation of a moving into a stationary target, stepped up their rate of fire. The result was the first evidence of confusion in the Confederate ranks. A soldier would look toward the comrade on his right, feeling meanwhile with his extended hand for the shoulder of the comrade on his left, and there would be a constant sidling motion in the latter direction as men continued to fall all down the line, leaving additional gaps that had to be closed. This might have gone on indefinitely, or at any rate until there were no survivors left to dress or dress on, but at last the order came for them to continue the advance, still on the oblique. This they did to the considerable relief of most of the bluecoats on the ridge ahead, whose reaction to the maneuver was one of outrage, as if they'd been exposed to a blatant indecency, such as the thumbing of a nose, though for others the feeling of revulsion was tempered by awe and incredulity. "My God, they're dressing the line," some among the waiting infantry exclaimed, more by way of protest than applause. In the course of the 10 or 15-minute lull allowed by the enemy guns before the attackers first appeared on the far side of the valley, the defenders had improved the time by repairing what little damage had been done to their improvised earthworks by the rebel cannonade. Now there was nothing left to do but wait, and in some ways that was the hardest thing of all. In fact, some among them found it downright impossible. Despite the renewed Confederate bombardment, they stood up behind their low stone walls or their meager scooped-up mounds of dirt and began to shoot at the graybacks half a mile away, only to have their officers tell them gruffly to hold their fire until the Johnnies came within decent range. Hayes, who was jumpy enough himself, being of an excitable nature, found a way to pass the time for the men of his two brigades. He put them through a few stiff minutes of drill in the manual of arms, despite the overhead hiss and flutter of going and coming projectiles. Meanwhile, the Union cannoneers kept busy, at any rate those who had husbanded their long-range ammunition for the opportunity now at hand, including the men in a 6-gun battery that came up with full limbers just as the lull was ending and replaced the departed Rhode Islanders in the position directly south of the clump of trees. Rittenhouse and Osborne had the best of it in this respect, slamming their shells in at angles that caught the advancing lines almost end-on, but others were by no means idle. "We had a splendid chance at 'em," one of McGilvery's captains later testified, "and we made the most of it." Watching the effects of this, the gnawed flanks and the plunging flags, the constantly recurring gaps all up and down the long gray front, the bluecoats cheered, and from time to time a man would holler, "Fredericksburg," elated by the thought that he was seeing or was about to see a repetition of that fiasco, though with certain welcome differences. On that field, for example, only the last 400 yards of the attack had been made in full view of the defenders behind their wall of stone and dirt, yet not a single one of the attackers had come within 20 yards of the objective. Here the critical distance was more than 3 times as great, and the waiting soldiers took much consolation in the fact that the respective roles of the two armies as attackers and defenders had been reversed. "Come on, Blue-Belly," the Rebs had yelled, but now it was the other way around. Now it was the Federals who were yelling, "Come on, Johnny, keep on coming," even though the Confederates were bringing no blankets or overcoats along, and their worn-out shoes would not be worth stripping from their corpses. On Pickett's right, Kemper's brigade was taking cruel punishment from the half-dozen guns on Little Round Top, whose gunners tracked their victims with the cool precision of marksmen and a monstrous shooting gallery, except that in this case the targets were displayed in depth, which greatly increased the likelihood of hits. Moreover, the slightest excess in elevation landed their shots in Garnett's ranks with fearful effect, as one of his officers would report, sometimes as many as 10 men being killed or wounded by the bursting of a single shell. But worse by far was the predicament of the troops on Pettigrew's left. Here Mayo's brigade, Virginians too, but fewer by half in number. Their heavy losses at Chancellorsville had never been made up, and they'd been under a series of temporary commanders for nearly a year, with the result that their morale had been known to be shaky even before the bloody action 2 days ago had taken its further toll. Caught the end on fire not of 6 but of 29 high-sided guns, with correspondingly greater suffering and disruption. As they tottered forward under the merciless pounding from the batteries on Cemetery Hill, these unfortunates had all they could do to maintain their alignment and keep their 4 flags flying. Whereupon, about 200 yards short of the Emmitsburg road, having passed the still-hot ashes of the house and barn set afire by the forenoon bombardment, they were struck on the flank by a regiment of Ohioans from the Union skirmish line, whose colonel massed and launched them in an assault as unexpected as it was bold. The reaction of the Virginians, it was they who on a sudden had become as still and thoughtful as Quakers at a love feast when they first learned that the attack was to be made and that they would have a share in it, was immediate and decisive. Despite their 4-to-1 numerical advantage and their well-earned heritage of valor, they took off rearward at a run, flags and all, to the considerable dismay of the onlookers who had told the Federal surgeons, "There go the men who will go through your damn Yankee line for you." And they did not stop until they regained the cover of Seminary Ridge. By quick subtraction, 4 of Pettigrew's regiments, nearly 1/4 of the total in his division, thus were removed from his calculations as effectively as if they'd stepped into bottomless quicksand. Osborne's gunners, observing the flight of the brigade, which up to now had been their sole concern, cheered lustily and swung their muzzles without delay along a short arc to the left. Their first shell burst in the midst of Davis's brigade, killing 5 men in one of his Mississippi regiments. Nothing quite like this abrupt defection had ever happened before, at least not in Lee's army, though the sight had been fairly common in the ranks of its opponents over the past 2 years, beginning at 1st Manassas and continuing through 2nd Winchester. Most Confederate witnesses reacted first with unbelief and then with consternation, but not Longstreet, who had steeled himself at the outset by expecting the very worst. Still seated on the snake rail fence at the far end of the field, he moved at once to counteract what he had seen through the shell bursts to the north, sending word for Anderson to commit his 3 remaining brigades, Wright's and Posey's and Mahone's. Lang and Wilcox had already been instructed to furnish such help for Pickett if it was needed, in support of the line thus weakened. No one could know whether the sudden collapse of this one brigade was indicative of what the others would do when the pressure intensified, but there was always the danger, even in quite sound units, that when a flank started to crumble, as this one had done, the reaction would continue all down the line. And in fact it did continue in one regiment under Davis, some of whose green troops took off rearward in the wake of the Virginians, but the other 3 held steady, taking in turn the end-on pounding from the batteries on the height as they kept up their steady progress across the valley. By now, the interior flanks of Pettigrew and Pickett had come together on the near side of the fence-lined Emmitsburg road, beyond which the blue skirmishers fired a volley or 2 before hurrying back to their own line, some 400 yards up the slope behind them. The resultant crowding of Fry's and Garnett's brigades, which occurred before the latter received the order that brought its marches off the oblique, presented a close-packed target the Union gunners did not neglect from point-blank range on the ridge ahead. "Don't crowd, boys," a rebel captain shouted, his voice as lackadaisical amid the bursting shells as that of a dancing master. There was, in fact, a certain amount of formal politeness as the two brigades came together, Tennesseans on the one hand and Virginians on the other, under circumstances designed to favor havoc. Southern courtesy had never been more severely tried, yet such protest as was heard was mild in tone. It was here that the classic Confederate line was spoken: "Move on, cousins, you're drawing the fire our way." Armistead was hard on Garnett's heels by now, and Kemper's men had drifted left, not only in an attempt to keep in touch with the latter's contracting line, but also in obedience to a natural inclination to flinch from the increasingly effective fire directed at their exposed flank from Little Round Top, as well as from the south end of the Federal Ridge, where McGilvery's 7 batteries were massed. From close in rear of his advancing troops, Pickett saw his and Pettigrew's lead brigades, crowded into a blunted wedge perhaps 500 yards in width, surge across the road and its 2 fences, taking severe losses from the opening blasts of canister loosed by guns that had been silent until now, and began their climb up the slope toward the low stone wall behind which the blue infantry was crouched. He saw that his men were going to make it, a good part of them anyhow, but he saw too, so heavy had their casualties been on the way across the valley, and so heavy were they going to be in storming the wall itself, which extended the length of the front and beyond, that unless the survivors were stoutly reinforced, and soon, they would not be able to hold what they were about to gain. Accordingly, he sent a courier to inform Longstreet of this close-up estimate of the situation. The courier, a staff captain, galloped fast to find old Peter, but even so he took time to draw rein in an attempt to rally some stragglers he found trotting toward the rear. "What are you running for?" he demanded, glaring down at them. One of the men looked up at him as if to say the question was a foolish waste of breath, though what he actually said was, "Why, good gracious, Captain, ain't you running yourself?" Too flustered to attempt an answer, the courier gave his horse the spur and continued on his mission, feeling rather baffled by the encounter. He found old Peter still perched atop a snake rail fence, observing through his binoculars the action on the ridge. The general listened attentively to Pickett's message, but before he could reply, a distinguished British visitor rode up, Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Fremantle of Her Majesty's Coldstream Guards. Despite his high rank in a famous regiment, this was his first experience of battle. "General Longstreet," he said, breathless with excitement, "General Lee sent me here and said you would place me in a position to see this magnificent charge." Then, observing for himself the struggle in progress on the ridge across the way, he exclaimed, "I wouldn't have missed this for anything." Old Peter laughed, an incongruous sound against that backdrop of death and destruction. "The devil you wouldn't," he said. "I would like to have missed it very much. We've attacked and been repulsed. Look there." All the colonel could see amid swirls of smoke on the slope at which the general was pointing, half a mile in the distance, was that men were fighting desperately. But Longstreet spoke as if the issue was no longer in doubt. "The charge is over," he said flatly. And then, having attended in his fashion to the amenities due a guest, he turned to the courier and added, "Captain Bright, ride to General Pickett and tell him what you've heard me say to Colonel Fremantle." The courier started off, but the general called after him, "Captain Bright." Drawing rein, John Bright looked back and saw old Peter pointing northward. "Tell General Pickett that Wilcox's brigade is in that orchard, and he can order him to his assistance." The courier galloped off at last, and the burly Georgian returned to watching the final stages of the action, pausing only to countermand his recent order for Anderson's 3 reserve brigades to be committed. Wilcox and Lang could go forward in accordance with Lee's original arrangements. Longstreet's final instructions, shouted after the courier when he first started back to Pickett, were more in the nature of a reminder than a command. But if what was happening on the ridge was only the prelude to a repulse, as he believed, then Anderson's 3 and Pender's 2 uncommitted brigades would be needed to meet the counterattack Meade would be likely to launch in the wake of the Confederates as they fell back down the slope and recrossed the valley. Fremantle marveled at his companion's self-possession under strain, remarking afterwards that difficulties seemed to make no other impression on him than make him a little more savage. In point of fact, old Peter kept his binoculars trained on the flame-stabbed turmoil halfway up the enemy ridge. He watched the fighting not so much in suspense as to the outcome, for that had been settled already, at least to his own disgruntled satisfaction, as to study the manner in which it came about. Convinced that the attack had failed even before the first signs of the retreat were evident, he was mainly interested in seeing how many of his soldiers would survive it. But they themselves had no such detached view of the holocaust in which they were involved. Massed as they were on a narrow front, flailed by canister from both flanks and dead ahead, the men of the 5 lead brigades were mingled inextricably. Few of them had any knowledge of anything except in their immediate vicinity, and very little of that. Everything was a wild, kaleidoscopic whirl, a colonel would recall. Fry, for one, thought victory was certain. "Go on. It will not last 5 minutes longer," he shouted as he fell, shot through the thigh while urging his brigade to hurry up the slope. Nearby, a lieutenant waved his sword and exulted as if he saw the end of the war at hand. "Home, boys, home," he cried. "Remember, home is over beyond those hills." Sheets of flame leaped out at the charging graybacks as the blue infantry opened fire along the wall. But they held their own fire until Garnett passed the word, which was taken up by officers all up and down the front. "Make ready, take good aim, fire low, fire!" Uphill sheets of flame flashed in response, and blue-capped heads dropped from sight beyond the wall. "Fire! Fire!" they could hear Federal officers shouting through the smoke and muzzle flashes. Still wrapped in his old army overcoat, Garnett rocked back in the saddle and fell heavily to the ground, dead, the Kernstown stain removed at last. Kemper, meanwhile, had turned and called to Armistead, who was close in his rear. "Armistead, hurry up. I'm going to charge those heights and carry them, and I want you to support me." His friend called back, "I'll do it," and added proudly, "Look at my line. It never looked better on dress parade." But Kemper by then was in no condition to observe it. He'd fallen, shot in the groin as he ordered the final assault. Pickett thus was down to a single brigade commander, and Pettigrew was in the same condition on the left, where only Davis remained, Marshall having been killed at about the same time Fry went down. Unhorsed by a shell on his way across the valley, Pettigrew had crossed the Emmitsburg Road on foot, and then had been painfully wounded in the hand as he began to climb the ridge. He remained in command, though his troops were mingled beyond the possibility of overall control, even if he could have managed to make himself heard above the tremendous clatter of firing and the high screams of the wounded. Nevertheless, like Pickett's leaderless 2 on the right, his 3 brigades continued their uphill surge, eager to come to grips with their tormentors beyond the wall. And for the first time on this field today, the rebel yell rang out. On the Union right, near Ziegler's Grove, Hancock watched with admiration as Hayes, whose northern flank considerably overlapped the enemy left, swung his N regiment forward gate-like to make contact with the Ohioans, who had halted after routing Mayo and had taken up a position facing southwest with their left on the Emmitsburg Road. As a result of this pivoting maneuver, which was accompanied by 2 brass Napoleons firing double-shotted canister, some 450 men who otherwise would have had no share in the fighting after the rebels actually struck the blue defenses well down the line and beyond their angle of sight, were placed where they could and did pump heavy volleys into the mangled flank of the attackers, adding greatly to the confusion and the carnage. Hancock shouted approval of this happy improvisation and took off southward at a gallop, intending to see whether the same could not be done at the opposite end of the position, which likewise extended well beyond the huddled mass of graybacks driving hard against his center. He rode fast, but even so he had cause to fear he would be too late. The stone wall along which his 5 brigades were deployed ran due south for a couple of 100 yards from Ziegler's Grove, then turned sharply west for 80 yards, thus avoiding the clump of umbrella-shaped trees before it made as sharp a turn again to resume its former direction. The jog in the wall, described thereafter as the angle, had caused Gibbon's men to be posted 80 yards in advance of Hayes's, which meant that they would be struck first, as indeed they were. Galloping southward along the ridge, Hancock was hailed by Arthur Devereux, who commanded one of the 2 regiments Gibbon had placed in reserve well up the slope behind his center. "See," General Devereux cried, pointing. "They've broken through. The colors are coming over the stone wall. Let me go in there." Reining his horse in so abruptly that he brought the animal back on his haunches, Hancock looked and saw that the report was all too true. Less than 200 yards away, due west and northwest of the clump of trees which partly obscured his view, he saw a host of butternut soldiers led by a gray-haired officer who brandished a sword with a black hat balanced on its point, boiling over the wall in hot pursuit of a blue regiment that had bolted. Some 200 undefended feet of the south leg of the angle had been overrun. "Go in there pretty goddamn quick," the general shouted, and spurred on southward to order Doubleday to repeat the flanking maneuver that was working so well at the far end of the line. That way, the breakthrough might at least be limited in width, and if Devereux got there in time, it might even be contained. Arriving, Hancock found that Doubleday, or anyhow the commander of the 1 First Corps Brigade attached for defense of the Union Center, had anticipated the order. G.J. Stannard, a former Vermont dry goods merchant and militia officer, had already begun the pivot maneuver and was wheeling 2 of his 3 regiments into an advanced position from which to tear the flank of the attackers pressing forward to exploit their narrow penetration of the south leg of the angle, directly in front of the clump of trees and less than 200 yards north of the point where Stannard's gate-like swing was hinged. Vermonters all, the 900 men of these 2 outsized regiments were 9-month volunteers. 9 monthlings hatched from $200 bounty eggs, scornful veterans had dubbed them on their recent arrival from the soft life of the Washington defenses. They had seen their first action yesterday and their army time was almost up, but they were determined to give a good account of themselves before returning home. Now the opportunity was at hand. Company by company, they opened fire as they wheeled into line, blasting the rebel flank. And as they delivered their murderous volleys, they continued to move northward, closing the range until their officers were able to add the fire of their revolvers to the weight of metal thrown into the writhing mass of graybacks. "Glory to God, Doubleday shouted, swinging his hat in approval as he watched from up the slope. "See the Vermonters go it."